Okay, I hope you all enjoyed that Chavruta time. We had a very almost somewhat simple type of Mishnah here and Gemara, where it made it very clear that based on Tikun Olam, which maybe we weren't exactly sure why Tikun Olam, and maybe we come up with a little bit of a differentiation depending on the reason. But we had this idea of Tikun Olam making it very clear to us that even though it's important to redeem individuals from captivity, on the other hand, came in Tikun Olam and said we can no longer do this. However, it gets a little tricky when we see a few other Sugiyot, like the Sugiyot in Ketubot and the Sugiyot in Gitin Daf Nun Chet. So I want to read through these Sugiyot with you and talk about, I'm going to not spend too much time on the content of the Sugiyot themselves, because I want to get to more of the interesting elements of what the Rishonim do with it, with Tosfot and then some others. But the first one is a very interesting source, which talks about a ketubah of a woman. This is just an interesting topic in and of itself, which is there's certain conditions that if you don't stipulate them in the ketubah is basically the rights that a woman has, that a husband commits to his wife. Okay, it's all sorts of commitments. So the Mishnah says, Lo katavla, if he didn't write in his ketubah, im tishtabai, if you become taken into captivity, that I will redeem you. Okay, if he didn't write that, and I'm not going to get into all the details here, but the Mishnah basically says if you didn't write that into your ketubah, chayav shu t'nai beitin. Okay, you're basically obligated because this is a t'nai beitin. What is a t'nai beitin? A t'nai beitin is basically something that we basically say. It's as if the court can force you to do this. This is just basic. I was in one of the groups and the woman said, thank God this is basic, right? Because what kind of husband would leave his wife being captured? So then the Mishnah continues and says, Nishbet, if she becomes taken into captivity, he has to redeem her. Okay. And the Gemara actually brings another Tanaitic source of Braita that says, even if they ask for up to 10 times her value, he has to redeem her the first time. If it happens again, he already doesn't have to. But the first time he has to redeem her. I'm not going to get into the second time and all that, but that's number one contradiction. Number two contradiction is the Sugiyot in Gitin, which basically says, this isn't in our parak, it's in the next chapter. And it says there was a case with Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya that he went to Rome, a big city in Rome, and they told him there was some child that was in jail, who's a beautiful child, and his hair curls are beautiful, and etc. He went to the Petach Beit HaSurim, to the jail, Amar. He starts quoting a pasuk, and basically the child answers the second part of the pasuk. And he says, wow, I'm very impressed with this child. Muftachani bo shemoreh hora'a b'Yisrael. And then he basically says, right, this person is clearly destined for greatness. Ha'avodah, I swear, she'eni zaz mikan, I'm not moving from here. Ad she'efdenu b'chol mamon sheposkim alav. I will pay any price. Amru, Lo zaz misham. This just reminds me of when my husband loves to tell the story that when they went to visit this house, they wanted to buy a house, and his mother came in and said, "Oh, I remember this house. My friend lived here when I was growing up, and it's my favorite house." And my father-in-law was like, "Shh, don't say that, because right, if they know you're willing to pay anything, they'll charge you any price, right? Like you're willing." So that's what I think about when he says, "Any price I will pay." Lo zaz misham ad shepta'o b'mamon harbei. Okay, so he basically ended up redeeming this child for a ton of money. Right now, you might have thought, right, and very soon after, what would you expect? They took more captives, right? But it doesn't say that. If we were in the Sugya, in our Sugya, that's what it would have said. But it said here, okay, he became a great teacher. And who was this? Manu, Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. So Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha basically became this great leader because he was saved from captivity in a way that goes perfectly against our Gemara. Now, first of all, I want to just point out something about Tosfot. This is very typical of Tosfot. I learned many years ago in university with Professor Tashma, Alav Shalom. He's an excellent professor. And one thing he taught us was the difference, and here you really see it, the difference between Rashi and Tosfot. Rashi comments on the Sugya. He's very much in the Sugya, and other Sugyot don't really bother him so much. Once in a while, he'll quote some other Sugya. Tosfot is always comparing other Sugyot. And one of the ways, and this is a really good way that you can remember this, okay? Because these are methodological points that are very important. Rashi was living the about a generation or two before the Baalei Tosfot, right? Rashi's grandsons were basically of the first Baalei Tosfot. Tosfot is not one person. It's a group of people that lived in France in the 1200s to 1400s. Rashi was living in Germany in the 1100s. And Rashi's time, people studied with their teacher. They basically went to their house. They lived in their house. A teacher would have 8 or so students that basically lived with him and did everything with him. They went with him to go pay Shiva calls. They went with him to weddings. They went with him everywhere, and they learned by example. And they basically learned with this rabbi. Tosfot, already in the 1200s in France, in Paris, the first university opens, and it starts to be a different type of a society. There was a big population explosion. And because of that, there were more people learning, and people couldn't learn anymore in their rabbi's house. And they started learning in places, not exactly a university, but it was almost somewhat university-like. And because of that, he says you have, instead of 8 people in a room, you end up with 30 people in a room. Now, when you have 30 people in a room, you have the benefit that someone says, oh, wait, I learned something here. And someone else says, I learned something there. And the style becomes more of a discussion between the students rather than the students just absorbing whatever the rabbi says. So that's why Tosfot is often very involved in trying to reconcile all these other sources. Now, one way of saying it could be there's differences of opinions, which anyone who learns Gemara knows that there are differences of opinions. But Tosfot likes to kind of put everything into a whole holistic picture. So Tosfot says, how do we deal with these contradictory sources? So what Tosfot says here, and we're going to read in Tosfot on our page. I wanted you to see here in my first question that Tosfot often quotes a sugya. He quotes it by the name of the chapter, Perek Na'ara. Now, you might not know that Perek Na'ara is a Masechet Ktubot, and it's Daf Nun Bet Amud Aleph. 1 dot means Amud Aleph, the first side. 2 dots means, like a colon, means Amud Bet. So he says, the fact that it says in Ktubot Nun Bet, and then he quotes our sugya, I'm going to skip. He says, Shane Ishto, a wife is different. Dahavya Kigufo Yoter Mibito. He says a wife is more like the husband than even somebody's daughter. And then they say, when it comes to your own, if you're stuck in jail, you can redeem yourself for whatever money you want. When we talked about Tikun Olam, we were talking about somebody else redeeming you. Now, we never said this when we learned the sugya there. But to Tosfot, it's very obvious. He says, number one, for sure you can redeem yourself. If you're stuck in jail and you have money, pay your way out. No one's going to tell you not to do that. So your wife is basically like yourself. So once we say yourself, then we can add your wife. And that gets rid of the wife's sugya very easily. What about Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya? That wasn't his wife, and it wasn't, right? And then we're stuck. So he says, what's the reason here? He gives 2 suggestions. One is Lefi shehaya muflag bechokhma. And then we get into a very tricky area, which is, right, we could say he was a huge Talmid Chacham. Now, he was only a kid, right? How much did he really show us? But he really saw his potential. And then it becomes very dangerous because then you play in numbers, right? You play a values game. Whose life is valued more than other people's lives? And can we save that person and not that person? It's a very dangerous answer. But he suggests that maybe because he was muflag b'chokhmah, he was so great. Or Inami gives a second suggestion, which is, oh, wait, that story happened b'sha'at Churban Habayit. Now, Churban Habayit, either you could say everyone was almost taken into captivity, or like everyone was kicked out of the country. Like it wasn't like there was going to be more situations of captivity to be had. So therefore, we're not worried about it at all. And the whole situation is not relevant. The Tikun Olam, right? So what we're basically saying is Tikun Olam either is going to be ignored in certain situations, like if the person's really smart, or if you're yourself, or we're going to say that maybe in certain time periods, it's not relevant. There's no concern for it. So because there's no concern, therefore, we don't have to worry about Tikun Olam. Now, Tosfot in another place, and this sometimes happens because, as I said, Tosfot is not one person. So it could be that the question was raised and some people answered one way and other people answered another way. And therefore, we're going to have another Tosfot in Gitin in that spot with the Rabbi Yeshua in that story. It says there, and this is a fascinating one, which again goes back. This is the question I asked in the beginning, which is what kind of captivity are we talking about? Ki ika sakanat nefashot. When there's danger to somebody's life, podin shvuyin yoter demehen. Like it says in Perek HaSholech, mocher atzmo ve'et banav le'ovdei kochavim. Here he quotes this other sugya, which you didn't see inside. I didn't have time to show you everything inside. But there it talks about if you sell yourself or your sons get sold to Ovdei Kochavim, you can be redeemed from there. Okay, we pay whatever money to get you out. And what's the reason there? Because we're worried that they'll make you become not Jewish. They'll make you become idol worshipers. So if the religion is at stake, he says, Kol sheken hachadika katla. Here, if your life is at stake, of course we're going to allow you to be redeemed. So now what he's basically saying is the sugya we talked about in our sugya, our first sugya that we started with, is just a financial thing. They just want money. Nobody's going to kill you. Nobody's trying to make you not lose your religion. No, it's just they put you in jail for a little while so that you'll pay your way out and they'll get money. But it's not talking about life-threatening situation. Of course, if your life is threatened, of course, we do anything in our power to allow you to get out. Comes the Ramban. I don't know if you got this far, but the Ramban basically says, what are you talking about? The Ramban says, Yesh omrim, and I think it's fascinating why he disagrees with him. He basically quotes the Tosfot as saying, there are those who say, and that's Tosfot and others, that if there's a concern for death, and he says, this is totally not relevant. Why? Or it doesn't seem to me to be the case. Dikol shevi, any, and this is fascinating one, any kind of captivity, kulu inube, has everything mixed in with it. In other words, if it's a woman, she might get raped. Okay, we're going to see that right now. And yet lo chashashu. Okay, he basically says, any captivity, they could rape you, they could murder you, they could do anything. There's no such thing as captivity for just money. Now, again, it could be a matter of, right, he was living in Spain and it was not so good in Spain, whereas Tosfot was in France, and maybe the situation was better there for the Jews, and maybe that's why. But he basically can't fathom such a thing, which means he basically says that obviously is not the issue, right? So he rejects Tosfot because it's unfathomable that there would be such a thing as captivity just for money. So that's an interesting way that he disagrees with him. Okay, what I want to kind of bring two more sources to finish off with is how this is relevant nowadays, right? So nowadays we know that this is a big issue, that people get kidnapped, and then the question becomes, right, at what cost do we return them? Do we return terrorists? It's a huge, huge issue. How much money will we give? All that. So the question is this allowed, or does this come under this issue of Tikun Olam? So our Rav Shaul Yisraeli writes, Kevan she'ela chayalenu. So now you might have thought, right, that so first of all, you clearly have the issue, they'll take more, right? They'll kidnap more people for sure. If they see that they get all these people out, that's exactly what goes on. They kidnap more people because they see, so it's a clear classic issue of Tikun Olam. Now, if you want to go with Tosfot, you could say it's sakana. They might get killed there, that for sure. But interestingly, he doesn't use that as his claim. Maybe because he holds with the Ramban that that's not a claim. So he says, what's the reason? He gives a very interesting answer, and you can take it or leave it. I wanted to leave you with some food for thought. Okay, our soldiers go out based on, right, the state of Israel sends them to protect us. There's an unwritten commitment, but clearly understood, even though it's not written. Okay, within reasonable bounds. Right, as long as they're not, he's kind of protecting himself, right? As long as they're not a national security issue. Right, that the government basically commits to do that. And he says, because of that, he basically says, and here he says, number one, he points out this thing, because it does have all these dangers in it. But he says, he's basically going to look at the state of Israel as an individual and says, since the state of Israel basically accepted this responsibility on behalf of the service that our chayalim do for them. He basically makes this fascinating jump that for the government of Israel to give money, to pay, to redeem a captive, they're basically redeeming themselves because they basically become one and the same with the soldiers. And therefore, it basically has nothing to do with this takana of impodim tashbuyim, because we already said that when it comes to yourself, you could do anything. So it's a very fascinating argument. It's not the one I would have thought to have used, but I wanted to bring that. And I wanted to end with a very famous story. The Maharami Rutenberg was taken captive. Okay, he lived in forgot to check exactly, but I think like 1400s. And it says here, he was captured and taken in a tower, kept captive in a tower for many years. And they wanted a lot of money. And the Maharami Rutenberg, now, based on what we learned, what would you say? He's a Chacham Muflag. He was a huge Talmud Chacham of his generation. And you would say, yeah, pay any money. And the people wanted to pay any money to get him out. And he wouldn't let them. And he basically dies in captivity. The fascinating part about it is he ends up getting redeemed. They get his body back. They pay for his body to get back after he dies, but they wouldn't redeem him in his lifetime because he wouldn't let them. And they say, why not? Right? Like, I don't understand. They say if he was worried about if he was worried, maybe he didn't think of himself as a Talmid Chacham of great, stature, even though he was. They said, but at least he should have worried about Bitul Torah. Like, people need him. And if he's not teaching, then people aren't learning. So they suggest what the Yam Shlomo, the Marashal, suggests is that maybe he was worried that if they captured me and they redeemed me, what would happen if they paid a lot of money, which is what they wanted? They would then take all the Torah scholars, and basically then all the Torah would be lost. And he was worried about that happening. That's at least the claim. He even says, and they were actually trying to capture the Rush as well, who was his student. And he ran away to Tolitulia and he was saved. And it could be because of that. Mutav sheta'abed ma'at chokhma yeteret mi'Yisrael, right? Better a little bit of this be lost on me, mima shetoved chokhmat Torah ikal. And basically for that reason, he wouldn't let them redeem him. So we have this fascinating discussion here that we basically, we didn't get through the whole, and right, we didn't see everything there is on the sugya, but we got a basic idea about this concept that on the one hand, you want to save an individual. On the other hand, you have to worry about the community and what the ramifications of your actions might be. And then you have other sugyas, which the second part of today's class was looking at how we reconcile contradictory sources, contradictory statements within the Gemara, contradictory stories, how we put them all together and make a whole picture out of them. And we saw different approaches to answering the question. And then we took it one step farther, which is practically speaking, how do we put this into action, where the Maharam was not willing to put it into action. However, we did see that Rav Shaul Yisraeli was willing to put it into action and even make this interesting jump to say that the state of Israel, basically all the soldiers are considered one and the same. It was a jump already to say Ishto Kegufo, but now even saying, right, not only that, but all the soldiers are basically considered one and the same with the state of Israel. So I hope it gave you food for thought, things to think about. And we will meet up next week at the same time, and we will learn another sugya of Tikun Olam, something totally different. And that's what's fun about these topics, that each week we get to do a different topic. And I will see you then. And we'll have a few minutes of questions and answers. We'll stop the class now, and we'll then anyone who wants to stay for some questions and answers is welcome to.